Let me introduce myself. I am Mirto. I'm a postdoc researcher at CRAS project at the Institute of Urban Research in the department at Malmö University. I want to welcome you all to the online workshop on short-term rentals impacting housing and impacted by COVID-19. I will say a few words about short-term rental platform that you're working on. Short-term rental platforms like Airbnb is a growing trend all over the world with millions of listings and thousands of agents worldwide. This phenomenon affects not only the hotel industry sector, but also the local communities and national housing markets, as well as it impacts the remaking of the cities and the territorial governance. STRs, where I'm going to call them STRs for now, were promoted as a response to the financial crisis for middle-class people who own a property that could share through the so-called sharing collaborative economy. The exploitation of the housing surplus as a commodity regards mainly the higher social classes, consolidating their position in the housing market, while the lower classes, which were supposed to be benefited, face the consequences. There is an urgent need of contemporary research upon the matter to consolidate knowledge about STR's impact, as well as the appropriate policies and enforcement that different cities need. However, the last months, almost a year now, we are all experiencing an unfolding crisis that impacted greatly, among a lot of things, the mobility and tourism, which are central features of the STR activity. The impact of the current crisis is complex as it's still unfolding, and its effects are not even known still, and probably it will define the way we move, travel, but also associate with home. With this workshop, we wish to bring together research teams and individual researchers from all around Europe for now, who are interested in STRs and their impact on housing, cities, and the local communities, to initiate a discussion also about the impact of the pandemic on STRs and the future beholds for them, the cities and tourism. Just to say some practical things, you can all send me questions to the chat, specifying to whom it is addressed, in case it is, and then I'm going to address the questions to the presenters, if we have time. I hope we will have time. We have 6 brilliant researchers who are going to present their work upon different dimensions of Airbnb and STRs from a critical perspective. And without further ado, let me introduce the first one. So the first one is Jelke Bosma, a PhD candidate at the University of Amsterdam. His PhD project looks into dynamics of value within Airbnb and is part of the ERC-funded project platform Labor. The title of his presentation is Airbnb as a Social Urban Infrastructure, and he's looking at the company's response to the new unfolding crisis by focusing on the partnerships that had established and establishes. So Jelke, if you want to start.
Yes, thanks. So I'm going to try to share my screen. So does this work?
Yes.
Great.
Perfect.
Okay, thanks for introducing me and for organizing this. Move your screens here. When COVID-19 first hit in March, I was just starting up my fieldwork in Amsterdam. I was planning to conduct interviews and go to all kinds of meetings related to Airbnb, but as you can imagine, these plans, they could not go ahead. So I started working on some other things, and one of these was to just basically try to keep track of how Airbnb itself responded to the crisis. And as you've probably seen, Airbnb got into a lot of trouble for one-sidedly cancelling outstanding reservations and leaving many hosts without income. But at the same time, I think Airbnb was also working hard to capture the value of the crisis. And that's what my presentation today will focus on. So it focuses not so much on short-term rentals themselves, but more on their regulation and the way Airbnb tries to influence these regulations. And the work I'll present is part of a joint project or a joint paper that I'm currently working on with my colleagues Niels van Doorn and Eva Mos. So when Airbnb secured the second $1 billion loan in April, Brian Chesky announced, and you can read here at the bottom of the slide, all of the actions we have taken over the last several weeks assure that Airbnb will emerge from the storm of the pandemic even stronger, regardless of how long the storm lasts. And I was very curious what that would be. What would a stronger Airbnb look like in the company's own ideal world? And in what ways might Airbnb actually benefit from the crisis and capture the crisis' latent value? And I suggested one of the ways forward is by building partnerships and trying to reinforce Airbnb's position as essential infrastructure. So in my presentation today, I'll start with a quick overview of the partnerships that Airbnb established recently during the COVID crisis. And next I'll try to answer why these partnerships are important for Airbnb by conceptualizing them as a kind of boundary resource that helps the company to take an increasingly infrastructural role. And lastly, I'll focus on the new Airbnb city portal and its role in partnerships between cities and Airbnb. And in particular, link it to the partnerships between the city of Amsterdam and Airbnb. So during the COVID crisis, Airbnb published a whole series of press releases on new partnerships they established. And this slide shows a few of the headlines of these press releases. And the general pattern was that organizations would get access to vacant Airbnb apartments for frontline care workers who temporarily had to work outside of their hometown or couldn't stay in their own home. And these partners were mostly health authorities, NGOs, governmental organizations, including the French government, the Red Cross, the International Medical Corps, and the International Rescue Committee. And what I noted is that a lot of these organizations are explicitly providing essential services, and they serve the public interest. And they take on functions and tasks that are usually connected perhaps to governments. And as short-term rentals over the past decade boomed, cities struggled with finding appropriate regulatory measures to curb housing shortages and complaints about over-tourism, as you are all aware as Airbnb researchers, of course. So Airbnb developed a very bad image in many places. And I think that partnering with cities and these public organizations, in this sense, forms a kind of corona washing. These partnerships help Airbnb to achieve kinds of institutional legitimacy, which in a company's own words should result in support for home sharing and our community of hosts. But that's not the complete story. I missed some slides here. Sorry. Yes. Airbnb has been active before in establishing partnerships. And here you see some press releases from, I think the first one is 2017 up until this year, where Airbnb has established dozens of partnerships, some promoting unique crafts and others fighting homelessness or domestic violence. And last but not least, there are a lot of partnerships with cities. And these city partnerships show that institutional legitimacy and a better image is not all there is to partnerships for Airbnb. And I will focus on the Airbnb city portal to tell a bit more about that. So the city portal was launched in September and it's still in a pilot phase. But Airbnb itself explains that it is intended to provide cities access to data on local Airbnb activity, to tools for enforcing regulations, and to direct communication channels to the platform. And as such, in its own words, the portal is ostensibly a first of its kind solution for communities partnering with Airbnb. So as you can see here, it's again about partnering. And it seems though that that Airbnb's push to initiate partnerships is not new. Airbnb has conducted this kind of boundary work since at least 2014, when it established its first European partnership with the city of Amsterdam. So this is a press release from that time. And since Airbnb's future growth and soon IPO are contingent on favorable regulations that allow short-term rentals, Airbnb has always assumed a proactive role as a regulatory entrepreneur. And city partnerships have been a key strategy in this respect. Although the precise contents and scope of such partnerships can be difficult to determine, I think there's a few hints, and I'll present my ideas on what these partnerships are, in my opinion. So I think that the city portal aims to minimize the relationship labor required to establish partnerships with cities, while casting regulation as a collaborative product rather than an outside threat to Airbnb. But before I continue on the city portal again, I'll take a short detour to focus on how I conceptualize partnerships. So I'm here taking inspiration from the work of Anna Helmont and colleagues, who have done a lot of work on platforms as infrastructure. And they show that in order to continue its market expansion and maintain power of the platform, Facebook in particular has to engage in boundary work with businesses and developers that connect to the platform. And such boundary work is crucial in setting the terms and conditions of engagement with the platform, and it defines how businesses can make use of the platform architecture. And Facebook is able to do this boundary work by developing sets of boundary resources, including, for example, the application programming interface, or API, that allows others to connect to the platform and integrate elements thereof in other applications. As such, platforms are able to, and here I quote, expand their boundaries while simultaneously embedding themselves into other markets by strategically orienting their programmability towards developers and businesses. And I kind of feel like that Airbnb's partnerships have a similar function as a boundary resource. And by establishing partnerships with cities and other organizations, Airbnb is able to establish modes of interaction and formal ways of engaging with cities, but all on the platforms, in platforms' own terms. So I try to visualize what this looks like. You basically have a platform which has to connect to assets, and in particular for Airbnb as a lean platform that tries to minimize its own asset ownerships. It's dependent on cities, and I visualize the cities as this dotted boundary here. And I think the partnerships help in connecting to these assets by connecting to the city and in turn to housing. So moving back to the partnership between Airbnb and Amsterdam. A so-called Memorandum of Understanding formally defines the terms of agreement between both parties. And prefiguring the city portal, these agreements included deals on taxation, on communication efforts related to local regulations, and on Airbnb's cooperation, although very limited, in sanctioning offenses by Airbnb hosts. And it should be noted that only Airbnb consistently refers to the collaboration as a partnership. This suggests that while partnership may sound amicable, it's also a site of contestation. So I think partnerships crystallize tense negotiations between cities and platforms. Where Airbnb gives cities something, it helps them to collect taxes, for example, but it also expects something in return, and in particular, favorable regulations. And the contention inherent to partnerships surfaced when, after 2 agreements, Airbnb and the city of Amsterdam did not renew their partnership in 2018. And this happened after Amsterdam forced Airbnb, or Amsterdam replaced the 60-day limit for renting out apartments with a yearly cap of 30 days. So Airbnb is willing to cooperate, but only on its own terms. On a more infrastructural level, Airbnb's collection of tourist taxes forms a step forward to logistically integrating the company's platform into a city's tax collection system. Such a move, where platforms take on functions that were previously undertaken by governments, has been a common strategy for other platforms as well, including Facebook developing internet infrastructure and Google and Apple creating technical infrastructure for COVID-19 tracking, for example. And tax collection appears to be central to Airbnb's city partnerships. It was part of Airbnb's early partnership with Amsterdam. It was part of 4 policy options in Airbnb's Citizens Policy Tool Chest. I think that was in 2016. And it is again promoted under the umbrella of the recent city portal. So cities that opt in receive all due tourist taxes in a frictionless manner, but are also unable to perform this function without Airbnb's assistance, which means that the company can leverage this dependency. And indeed, the Amsterdam Court of Auditors recently warned that the Amsterdam City Council was too reliant on platform companies for collecting tourist taxes from short-term rentals. So urban platforms, and Airbnb in particular, they need the goodwill of city administrations. But these cities, on the other hand, increasingly come to depend on Airbnb, not only because it provides the infrastructure for tourist collection, but also because the actual taxes generated by short-term rentals keep on increasing. So when Airbnb started collecting taxes from hosts in 2015 in Amsterdam, the amount collected grew to 5.5 million, compared to 500,000 before the deal. And although exact figures over recent years are unavailable, Airbnb's market share had already doubled in 2018, and total tourist taxes were expected to increase to 200 million euros in 2020. So that's a 400% growth compared to 2015. So I think it's safe to say that Airbnb has become a significant contributor to Amsterdam's tax base, and the city would certainly feel the economic impact of a reduction in short-term rentals, and especially in the wake of the pandemic. So, anticipating this situation, Airbnb's head of global policy and communications, Chris Lehane, has claimed that with its city portal, Airbnb has a more powerful economic empowerment story than it's ever had. Here, Airbnb's narrative of economic empowerment and entrepreneurial boosting, which initially pertains to the alleged middle-class hosts that are struggling to pay their rents and mortgages, now also includes city administrations struggling with the COVID-19 induced tourism bust as its the target audience. So cities are now also the target audience of these of this economic empowerment story. So the COVID-19 tourism bust reinforces Airbnb's value proposition towards cities, which are missing crucial tourist revenues during a pandemic and will most likely be hit by another crisis in which municipalities will have to bear the brunt of the fiscal and economic consequences of the COVID-19 crisis. Moreover, Airbnb's economic empowerment story hinges on not just the extra tax income, but crucially on valuable access to data as well. And here I quote Chris Lehane again. We have more travel data than just about any platform in the world, and that's really significant. So I think that in this slide, partnering with Airbnb suddenly seems much more palatable to cities. And in a recent vacancy for a software engineer, Airbnb City Portal is thus also described as a regulatory product platform that allows us to offer product solutions to cities around the world with minimal to no engineering effort. So, just looking at the time, can I take a few more minutes, Mirta? Thanks.
Yes.
great. So Airbnb, the portal aims to streamline Airbnb's boundary work vis-a-vis cities by promoting its integration with municipal systems and operations, while simultaneously reducing the relationship labor or the effort that Airbnb has to invest in establishing and maintaining city partnerships. And the portal allows Airbnb to offer a comprehensive product that can easily be adapted to the need and circumstances of different cities. And importantly, while regulation was once a threat to disruptive platforms, Airbnb is now attempting to create customized regulatory products that are supposed to regulate its own activities. So a few concluding remarks. Airbnb has always presented itself as economically empowering, and it continues to do so, but I feel like it's now pulling this increasingly towards a new higher scale where cities are the target audience. So partnerships and the city portal now try to recast Airbnb as a solution, not only to citizens, but cities as well. And as cities are hit by the COVID-19 crisis, they seem to be extra vulnerable to this story, both to the direct loss of economic activity from tourism, but in the near future as well from the effects of the financial crises. And while partnering may seem attractive, these partnerships help Airbnb to further entrench themselves in cities, and these cities are at risk of further losing their own autonomy in defining and enforcing regulations. So on the one hand, this is quite a speculative story because we'll have to see how this turns out over the coming years. But Airbnb is already establishing new partnerships. And there's one here that's an older one. Airbnb promotes Small Town Italy with Italian Villages projects. But the other three press releases here refer to newly established partnerships, all from September and October this year, where it looks like Airbnb has been successful in convincing cities and tourism organizations of this story. Thanks for your attention. That was it for now.
Thank you very much, Jelke. Thank you very much. I really like the idea of that city is profiting directly from STRs, because for me it's also indirectly in many ways. And I also like the term corona washing. It's really interesting. So looking forward to see more for this project. And moving on, the next presenter, Chiara Iacovone. She's an urban geographer that she's currently a PhD candidate at Politecnico di Torino and a member of the Interdepartmental Research Center Future Urban Legacy Lab. Her presentation investigates Airbnb's configuration in post-financial crisis territories in relation to austerity policies, connecting it with the financialization of real estate sector. She's also initiating the discussion about the impact of the global pandemic on the STR market, and her focus is on the so-called European peaks. So, Chiara, if you want to start.
Yeah, to share the screen. Okay. Okay. Can you see? Okay. Thank you for the presentation, and thank you for the invitation to this workshop. I think this could be a great opportunity to exchange ideas. So, okay, good morning, everyone. Today I will drive my intervention on the relation between the spatial and economic infrastructure of Airbnb, mostly showing some data of pre-pandemic condition, just to open up to further discussion on how, what, and if something has changed or will change in the future of short-term rental platform in this new paradigm. So I will show you today some data that I elaborated for my PhD research. So briefly, my work focused on the analysis of Airbnb data in its critical configuration of these post-financial crisis territories, which is the Southern European region, stressing the strong connection with the financialization of real estate sector. So indeed, the research analysis how austerity policies have had an impact on the further urbanization processes in 4 cities of the European peaks that are Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain, and cities in focus are Lisbon, Madrid, Naples, and Athens. And so how such policies open up housing and rental market for new international economic player to join new market segments such as the short-term rental one. So basically I use Airbnb mostly as a tool, like as a lens through which I could read the housing market performances, the financialization processes, and the commodification practices in these territories. This phenomenon has to be contextualized in a global economic panorama strongly oriented towards the real estate market. So residential property constitutes the first asset class globally in terms of value, represented as 60% of the world's wealth, including stocks, bonds, and gold. So this condition resulted from a half-a-century processes where the real estate market mutually fed itself with the neoliberal state ethos of the property-owning democracy, leading to what Samuel Stein defined the real estate state in a recent book. So in this context, the residential function of housing is subject to its value as an asset. The real estate market, it's worth about 217 trillion of US dollar, almost 60% of the value of all global assets, with residential real estate comprising the 75% of the total, as it can be read in a recent UN report. So therefore, trading of housing as a commodity is nothing new. While referring to the commodification of housing, refer to the progressive growth of a large part of housing production and consumption, aimed only at the speculation and not even contemplate in habitation. So Airbnb gained a relevant role in such discourse, in such economic sector, representing one of the major short-term rental platforms currently available. Airbnb has revolutionized the hospitality and housing market since its inception in 2009. As for all the Silicon Valley tech companies, the founding and evaluation system of venture capital defines Airbnb performance. So nevertheless, disaggregating the downturns of the markets, especially the current, what Airbnb introduced was a concept enabling potentially all the global commodification of any single housing unit around the world. So such concepts include the economic model that made predilect the short term to the long term rent for real estate investors. As Agustín, Cocola-Gant, and her colleague Nagago wrote in a recent article, two are the main features that made Airbnb the best channel to monetize in housing, that are the flexibility and profitability, so that housing are not blocked in a static long-term rental contract and always available to put in a market to extract their values. So what I want to propose you is it's another kind to look at the platform, highlighting two main cores that could produce other kinds of model of interpretation. So the first one is that Airbnb, it's not a peer-to-peer platform anymore, but rather we should consider it a business-to-consumer platform. It means that it links commercial activities rather than peers. And the second one is that Airbnb should not only be seen as an urban phenomenon, but we should be taking in consideration also its network capacity. So assuming this hypothesis, my broad research question moves toward the investigation of the role of Airbnb as a possible link in the financial chain of the real estate market. And if we could use Airbnb as a tool to have a geography of financial flows that are investing the housing market. So basically, the research proposed to study Airbnb prospectively in order to have an overview on what are the geographies of housing financialization. So with this aim, the infrastructure that emerge are dual: a physical infrastructure that involve the real estate asset around the world through Airbnb platform, and a financial infrastructure that links a network of actor, praxis, investments, public programs, incentives, policies that constitute the financial chain that manifests itself in a short-term rental market. So as I mentioned before, the research focused on 4 cities, Lisbon, Madrid, Naples, and Athens, of the so-called European peaks. This unpleasant acronym comes from an article of the Financial Times called Pigs in Muck, describing the European crisis condition, reinforcing the rhetoric of the Southern laziness and their economic unaccountability in the times of the financial crisis. So starting from those years, my research retraced the set of policies at the urban, national, and European level that were made to stress the housing market as a response of the economic crisis, such as the liberalization of rents in Portugal, the mortgage law in Spain, the new tax regime in Italy, and the high housing costs in Greece. So those policies led to an explosion, an exposition of the yet unsaturated housing market, and together with the incentives of capital attraction, such as the subsidized tax regime for the non-resident, non-permanent resident, or the golden visa. So finance had the possibility to enter in the former static housing market of Southern Europe. So I will not talk of these so much because I think that other speakers will focus better on singular cases. But just to contextualize, in those years, the growth and the evolution of the touristic industry have had a strategic role. So the new forms of touristic accommodation that encouraged to rent out private property rose up, triggering a decrease of the traditional facilities. The new model supported by Airbnb is indeed one of the most profitable and most adopted worldwide. And from the creation of the platform, Airbnb spread all over the world. And while austerity urbanism was designing these crisis cities, deregulating most of the social assets, the platform had like a clear path to grow under an unregulated economic regime. And a relevant consequence of this unregulated development is the spreading mechanism of the buy-to-let in the range of Airbnb properties carried out by professional actors mainly. So property managers, real estate firms, and broadly transnational landlords took advantage from the extensiveness and the flexibility of the platform to enlarge their market. So let's return to the two hypotheses. So I want to share you some data of the pre-pandemic condition that in my opinion, could open up to some reflection about the future of the short-term rental market. So all the data presented are from 2019 and are took from the European database provided by RDNA, a commercial data scraper firm. So to investigate the first hypothesis, so that Airbnb from being a peer-to-peer is becoming a business-to-consumer platform, the methodology that I've used moved toward the definition of what has been called the multi-host. So Airbnb host with multiple properties in comparison with single host. So first of all, there are the maps of the concentration of properties in the city district. So all the cities show a high concentration in the city center. So Athens has the 52.8% of properties in the central district. Madrid has the 44.4%. Naples has the higher concentration, the historic center, with 35% of properties, then 20.4% in the coastal district of Chiara and Posillipo. And while Lisbon is more distributed, Santa Maria Maggiore has the 19.1% of the properties, then the Freguesia of Misericordia has the 16.6%, and the Arroyos has the 14.1%. While in the graph next to the maps, they show the number of Austen properties in each cities. So these circles show the absolute number, and of course Madrid will have a much higher number. But in all the cities, the ratio between Austen properties is clearly never not 1-to-1. So indeed, the line graph show a first division between single and multi-properties host. So here the multi-properties hosts are calculated as hosts with 2 or more than 2 properties. So looking, for example, at Athens, the graph showed that the 26.4% of the hosts are multi-properties hosts, then they own the 60.2% of all the properties. While the drawing just below the maps represent the central districts of the cities, and the color part show the percentage of the property owned by the multi-host. So in all of the districts, the percentage is higher than 50%, and in particular, the Santa Maria Maggiore in Lisbon has the 78% of properties owned by multi-host. And also the central district of Madrid has a percentage of 68.3%. So, well, this graph show a focus in a composition of the multi-properties host. Even if a clear definition of multi-host in the literature is still missing, we can argue that some of the hosts that have 2 properties could be like family house or second house, or a rent or double room rents or something like this. So very roughly we could like exclude from the definition of multi-host if we consider multi-host professional actors. So from this graph, we could see so the ratio between the host and the properties, and the last bar are of particularly interest. For example, Madrid. In Madrid, 40 hosts own more than 50 properties each, with a total amount of 3,991 properties. Yeah, who are actually these actors? These tables shows the top 25 multi-host for each cities, and it show what they are actually, if they are, that show that they are actually professional actors. So the color box shows their affiliation, if they are property managers, other short-term rental platform, or actually construction firms. While these other tables shows the headquarters of the companies, if they are in the city, in the country, or elsewhere. So some of the countries are affiliated to each other, and so in general they represent a network of national and transnational companies. So much of them are related to each other. So in fact, the other hypothesis was to look at Airbnb beyond the urban scale. So in fact, the actor that we have mentioned, as we have just seen, are actually other kind of platform or firms that work in the real estate market. So their range usually go beyond the city of origin, even if the headquarters is in that city. So this elaboration that you see has been made interrogating the whole European data set. This means it's what I did is I took the information of the host of the cities, and then I expanded the research of the properties not only to the city but to the old Europe. So the very first issues that comes out is in all the cities between 10 or 20% of what we have called the single host, just to slide before, are fake one. This means that the host in one city has one properties, while in other cities have multiple. And like for example, an emblematic case is in Athens, where the host called E-Domicil has one property in Athens, while in the rest of Europe has 1,446 properties. So also reading the databases could be tricky. So the line graph, the bar graph here show the percentage of hosts with a majority of property inside or outside the city, and this next one shows the relative properties of hosts. So enlarging the network of the host to the whole database, we will see, for example, in Naples, that if we consider the entire network, the host, the properties, in Naples are only the 39.9%, while the one in Italy are the 35.6%, and in Europe the 24.2%. So there's an increment of properties if we look at the old database of the host based in Naples of plus 58.8%. So while the semicircles indicates if the property of the same host are in a network of inside or outside one. So we can see that Naples clearly has an inclination toward the outside, and this perhaps because of the proximity with the Amalfi Coast and the island, while, for example, Madrid has mostly an internal market, although it has 39.6% of outside network. But so what all this graph does it mean spatially? This this is a representation of the network generated from the properties of multi-host outside the cities of origin. And it's, I think that this represents another kind of representation of Airbnb's tentacular network. It tells us the geography drawn by Airbnb goes much beyond the urban scale. And also it draws a geography of capital fluctuation, because each of these connection lines represents houses managed by real estate company, property manager firms, and other actors involved in the housing market. So it draws, I think, also an infrastructure of economic fluxes and physical assets. So to conclude, what I want to show you with my presentation is that Airbnb in a pre-pandemic condition was highly dominated by professional actors, real estate companies and investors and so on. So well, the response of Airbnb to the pandemic was like mainly technical. Firstly, Airbnb introduced a very detailed cleaning manual, then start to advise the host to be more flexible, to support the uncertain condition for the travelers, to consider the mid-stay or the long stay, to start to offer discounts, to modify the internal spaces to create a zone for the remote working. So all of these highly suggested options are realistic options, maybe mostly for professional hosts that usually work with professional cleaning services and manage houses not inhabited, that could be, of course, more flexible, could be, of course, in the long stay, and could be rearranged for internal spaces. So my point is, and my open question is if Airbnb, to save itself from this situation, will move towards to a always more professional offer, to continue to attract guests, and offer like structure that are aligned with sanitary requirements, and gradually the smallest hosts will be forced to leave the platform. I don't know. So maybe perhaps this is a very too negative perspective, but I will want to discuss this with you, and I finish. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And I love the visualization in your work. It seemed like you processed a lot of data, and there are some questions already for you, but I will address the questions only after we all finish, if is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
So let's move forward to Agustín and Simone. Agustín is a research fellow at the Instituto de Geografia e Ordenamento do Território da Universidade de Lisboa. I'm trying to say that right. And Simone Tulumello is an assistant research professor at the University of Lisbon at the Institute of Social Sciences. Their presentation stems at the intersection of their work on projects HOPS, Housing Perspectives and Struggles, and Smart Tourism, Holiday Rentals and Rehabilitation, and focuses on Lisbon. In their presentation, they are reflecting on the urban change that STRs boom brought about. They are also commenting on STRs professionalization, even though they are considered to be part of the sharing economy, and discussing also the current challenge that imposed by the pandemic. So the floor is yours. Sorry, you have to unmute your microphone. Sorry.
Yeah. Hello. Good morning. Thank you, Mirto. Can you see my PowerPoint? Good. So I'm gonna start presenting for maximum 10 minutes, and then Simone will continue. Okay. So I'm Agustín. I'm gonna present basically the result of a project that we have been doing for the last 2-3 years in Lisbon. But also I want to make hypotheses of what is going on right now with the pandemic. I will try to relate my presentation with Jelke presentation and Chiara presentation. I found very, very interesting. So basically, one thing that we did last year was to interview short-term rentals management companies. Okay, so these multi-listing hosts that Chiara was talking about. So we had a lot of qualitative information about what they do and about these networks that Chiara was talking about. And also, I want to make hypotheses of what is going on right now. So I am not sure because there is a lot of uncertainty, but my hypothesis is that the pandemic will weaken the position of Airbnb. So I'm going to contradict a bit what Jelke presented. Sorry. Okay. So basically, the situation in Lisbon, I'm not gonna talk a lot about this because it's something that you know is from sharing economy to business to consumer platform as Chiara presented. So fast growth, concentration in city center, entire apartment, commercial listings, 85% of the short-term rental supply. And these have produced a housing crisis, displacement of communities, touristification. This is something that all European capitals or all European tourist cities have also experienced. So I'm not going to talk about this, and I want to talk more about what is going on in the past few months. And so, at the moment, we have seen how the occupancy rate of Airbnb in this summer is very, very, very low. We need to consider that in the past summer, in August, at least in Lisbon, the occupancy rate of Airbnb was 99%, so almost 100. And at the moment, is 10% in Madrid, 11% in Barcelona, 25% in Lisbon, 25% in Rome, for example. In Paris, 13% is very, very, very low. So, and the point is, the question is, what is going on with the short-term rental supply? Is moving to the long-term rental market, yes or no? This is something also that I want to discuss today. As you can see, we have data from long-term rental platform, long-term rental stock. So how many properties they were offering last year in September, and you can see how many properties are offering now. So basically, especially in Southern Europe, in tourist cities, the supply of long-term rental in theory is basically double. The difference, you can see, for example, Lisbon, 3,000, and now you have 6,000. Madrid, 12,000, 25,000, okay? So the variation, here you can see the variation of long-term rental stock is basically double the supply. So the question is there a move from short-term rental to long-term rental? How is the market responding to the crisis? This is the question. This is gonna mean that we're gonna see the end of housing crisis, that tenants will have more opportunities to rent in the long-term rental market. My hypothesis is no. My answer to this question is no, and I want to explain why. And this is when I want to explain what are they doing, the short-term rental agencies, management agencies, what they are doing. So basically, what I think that is happening is a move from short-term rentals to mid-term rentals. This report by RDNA was released already in April. So after 1 month of the pandemic, they were already seeing how hosts in Airbnb were offering discounts for stays longer than a month, okay? So my hypothesis is that landlords don't want to move to the long-term rental market because they want to control the property. They don't want tenants. They want this flexibility of the short-term rental market that Chiara was talking about. So my hypothesis is that landlord wants to speculate for a few months until the short-term rental market come back. And how they are doing this is what I'm going to talk about now. So basically, we need to think about the short-term rental management companies. And I want to relate this with platform real estate. And this is also why I think that the position of Airbnb will be not stronger but weakened in the future. Basically, what we are seeing is these short-term rental management companies that are transnational companies, and this is why the network that Chiara was talking about, as Hostmaker that was created in London, but now is in every capital city, basically in Europe. I have to say that, for example, in Lisbon, we have identified more than 40 of these companies. So the multi-listing hosts are basically not property owners, are management companies. And they use a technology that has been used by hotel industry for several years, which are channel managers. What are channel managers? So how you advertise the same apartment in different channels at the same time. So what we are seeing is a growth of platforms, not just Airbnb as the dominant platform, a growth of platforms, and they advertise the same apartment in several platforms at the same time. There are channel managers that allows you to advertise the same apartment in 60 platforms, okay? And they were using this system, channel managers, before the pandemic. And they were advertising, of course, on Airbnb, but on Booking, on TripAdvisor, and HomeAway, etc., etc. But what we're seeing now is how these transnational companies, short-term rental management companies, are advertising the same apartments in platforms that, in theory, were for long-term rental rent. In this case, for example, you can see here Supla, which is from the UK, or you can see here Idealista, which is a platform for long-term rentals in Spain and Portugal. So basically, yeah, we are seeing this is from Portugal, and this is you can see the pictures of Idealista. We are seeing a lot of Airbnb apartments in Idealista advertised now. But when you go to see the description of the adverts, they say mid-term rentals. They say the rent is for 3 months, 6 months. They don't want to do a stable contract for a tenant. That is not going to happen. And that's not going to happen because first, they want to speculate, and second, they are using these several platforms and channel managers to organize the market. So, and the point is, there is a growth of new platforms for mid-term rentals that are happening at the moment, especially for example, international student markets as Uniplaces, or especially for digital nomads. Now, in the past few months, that people is working from home, so middle-class European people is also using this opportunity as moving to the south even more than in the past few years, and renting apartments for a few months. And now you can see here these two platforms for mid-term rentals that focus on the digital nomad market, which is Flatio and Nomads. Nomads is from Portugal, and Flatio is from the Czech Republic, but they have emerged now, and we have seen how the supply of the listings they have grown exponentially in the past few months. And so my hypothesis is that Airbnb is not going to be anymore the dominant platform, because the situation right now is much more complicated. And actually, short-term rental management companies wants to get rid of Airbnb. They don't want the mediation of Airbnb anymore. Airbnb get a fee of 15–16%. They want to get rid of that fee and make a cheaper product. And so if you go to many of short-term rental management companies, you can book the apartment with them without the mediation of Airbnb. And something that I didn't mention is that in Lisbon, these companies control almost 50% of the market. And this is something, a methodological challenge that we can talk with Chiara before, because how do you measure this? How do you measure the multi-listing? I guess that you were using the ID host that they have on Airbnb. But now what is happening is that, for example, Hostmaker, they have 250 apartments in Lisbon, but they don't have an ID on Airbnb. Why? Because it's individual hosts that give the management of the companies to them, but the individual hosts keep the ID on Airbnb. So the share of the market that they control is much bigger than what the multi-listing situation shows. And this is a methodological challenge. Sorry. So basically, just to finish my hypothesis, I just want to share with you like a commentary that I wrote in May, which is short-term rentals, COVID, and platform capitalism, in which I tried to explain this situation of growth of different platforms, growth of management companies, and how they are using these technologies to speculate for a few months and waiting for the market to emerge. But as I said, my hypothesis is that first, we will not see a move from short-term rentals to long-term rentals. So this, and second, I think that the position of Airbnb will be weaker in the future. But this is something that I say is an hypothesis that we can discuss later on. And yeah, and I finish now, and then I give the voice to Simone. It's just to say that my aim was to open a discussion and not to present results of anything, but yeah.
Thanks, Agustín, and also thanks Mirto for the invitation and everybody here. And yeah, actually I took for myself in negotiation with Agustín the easier side of the discussion, which is building on the stuff you've been guys have been researching and trying to think a bit in these terms. And I would like to share with you 4 ideas which more or less links, not just with the case of Lisbon and not just Lisbon that Agustín made, but also with Jelke and Chiara's arguments. And the first point would be starting from, you know, what Mirto in the introduction said, you know, this idea of Airbnb and similar as a response to the crisis, which is definitely coming back again now with this new crisis. I was seeing this morning an article on Visão, which is this Portuguese magazine that is becoming increasingly the voice of the real estate sector. And they say now more than 50,000 families that live on short-term rentals are in a very bad situation. You know, this idea that first this was useful for people to get out of the crisis, and now the crisis of Airbnb is bringing people to the crisis. But I think it's beyond looking at these conjunctural dimensions. If we look in the long term, we can probably, and that's what I'm going to try in the other 3 points, try to go, and in this sense, it's more like an opening to a research agenda than conclusions, again, similarly to what Agustín was saying. How can we work toward historicizing short-term rentals as a piece of a longer trend of the transformation of what Harvey would call the second circuit of accumulation, particularly in semi-peripheral economies like Southern European ones, but not only. And so the second point will be, the pandemic, how to put the pandemic in this longer term transformation. And in a sense, what I see is that pandemic is somehow deepening and accelerating trends that were already existing. For instance, in Lisbon, the municipality, but not just the municipality, had for some years already trying to overcome the rhetoric about Lisbon as the tourist city and was investing in digital nomads, etc. It wasn't so successful in a way. It was very successful with tourism, less with other types of flows, etc. Maybe now this can give them the opportunity to be more successful on this type of markets. And definitely what we're seeing is, and we probably will see less of this extreme concentration in cities like Lisbon. They are trying now to go from a semi-peripheral context to a more central context in the international division of real estate labor, so to speak, toward like a more complex patterns, not just of tourism, but floating city uses, as they defined some colleagues from Porto in an article on urban geography. And the role of tech here is important. What Agustín was mentioning, there is a beautiful article by Desiree Fields on how technology and platforms have helped make manageable the market of rentals, which was much harder to manage in a centralized way, especially in the United States market when you have thousands of properties like spread around many markets. And I pretty much agree on what Agustín says, that Airbnb may well not survive. Well, Jelke is suggesting that he may survive, but basically it's somehow changing its own nature. But the point is, it's the platform as infrastructure that will survive, irrespective of the fact that Airbnb itself will survive or not. And so the question, again, for the research agenda will be looking at the infrastructure more than at the individual actors, which is a very hard task, especially if, as Agustín was showing us, it becomes much more fragmented. You don't have like one players through one instrument to study, like DNA was very powerful a few years ago, but now, it's just catching part of the market. This is going to be much harder to grasp in the future. And so, third point, role of the state. And it's becoming even more evident now that short-term rentals is much less a market revolution and much more a field where, yes, there is innovation, particularly in technology, but it intersects with long-term regulations, call it neoliberal or not, all the type of regulation that allowed the liberalization of housing or real estate and shifting housing units towards markets like. In this sense, it's interesting to see, and I go back to Jelke's presentation on how these actors are somehow changing their posture vis-a-vis institutions. Back in the day, they were presenting themselves as disruptors. They were attacking local governments because they weren't, easing innovations, etc. Maybe now they're becoming much more similar to traditional institutional investors in the sense of looking for corporations, partnerships, etc. One could say old wines in new bottles. And in this sense, I think what would be interesting is, again, for research, trying to go toward a critique which is not a fetishization of Airbnb. Not just because Airbnb itself may die, but because these dynamics change relations of power. For instance, what does it mean having more platforms around? There will be competition or not? And will this mean, for instance, that they will have less or more power in terms of lobbying? One of the things that we know that Airbnb has been very powerful at lobbying at the European level. but recently is maybe losing some grasp. There's been some recent decision of the European Court of Justice that have gone against previous decisions, and maybe Airbnb itself is not so powerful as it was just a couple of years ago. So this new and possibly more fragmented territory, what does it mean? Are we witnessing the emergence of a true market there? I'm not sure, but yeah, we should be reflecting on this. And finally, in terms of politics, which I think is, again, very important, not to fetishize platform as something that is there and there's nothing we can do about it. I mean, like what we witnessed in Europe in the previous 4 or 5 years is a strong repoliticization of housing. Much more in Spain and Greece, but also in Portugal, and to a lesser extent in Italy, to stay in Southern Europe, but well beyond Southern Europe. And there have been some results. I mean, like Berlin's rental freeze, not really a freeze, happened. Even in Portugal, there's been some change in the policies which would have not happened without. I mean, in Spain and in Greece, you had, with all the contradictions and problems, governments that emerged also through the protest and the struggles linked to housing. Again, they didn't solve the thing, but they did something. They changed the political framework. So again, and last question for discussion is, as the short-term rental market changes and this new complex environment of platforms emerges, where are new possibilities for organization and struggle? Does it mean that local movements, local activism will have more or less power to face these actors, which are of course located in different places? Recently, it was interesting to me the map Chiara made on, you know, where all these superhosts are based. Well, the vast majority of them up until now are locally based. So in fact, there will be scope to go there at their door, knocking at their door, and organizing protests there. We haven't done that. Maybe also because we were thinking, oh, it's Airbnb, you know, it's in San Francisco. How can you go and fight with them? But maybe we can fight with these intermediaries. And so, yeah, this is it, you know, just trying to think in terms of, yeah, on the one hand, historicizing and looking this not just as one disruption, but a part of a longer trend, and the other, yeah, which is what concerns probably me the most in critical urban studies, not fetishizing the enemy, so to speak. That's it, thanks.
Thank you, both of you. I was also feeling that the same thing, that they are not moving into the long-term rental, but rather to the medium-term rental. And Dimitris can say more because he's also researching Athens. And I'm also really disappointed for this complex system that short-term rentals are going into. Yes, thank you very much, both of you. And let's move to Dimitris Pettas. Just a moment. He's a Marie Curie fellow at the Institute of Urban and Regional Planning in Technical University of Berlin, and his project Dual Links explores the qualitative, geographical, and space transformative characteristics of platform economy in Athens, Greece, and Berlin, Germany. The title of his presentation is The Impact of the Pandemic upon Tourism, Housing, and Short-Term Rentals in Athens, Greece. And he will focus on the impact of the pandemic on housing conditions, urban life, and the short-term rentals landscape in Athens by drawing upon initial indications of how well-established housing inequalities were deepened, and formulating hypotheses concerning the future of STRs in Athens. So, Dimitri.
Thank you very much once again. Can you hear me? Okay. So I haven't prepared an actual PowerPoint, but I'm going to talk. So what I'm going to present is articulated in 3 parts. So first, I'm going to talk about how my presentation exclusively focuses on the pandemic period. So the first part concerns how the pandemic affected urban life and housing in Athens. The second part concerns how short-term rentals were transformed during that period. And the third part concerns some hypotheses for the future. So what we witnessed in Athens, and probably most cities around the world, is that the condition of the pandemic, especially during the quarantine period, violently deepened pre-existing social inequalities that were expressed in both private, public, and semi-public spaces. So first, not everybody experienced the stay-at-home condition in the same way. According to data from the 2011 census in Greece, so long before the socioeconomic crisis was fully translated into a housing crisis in the form of evictions, energy poverty, rent laws, etc., and even before the short-term rentals boom in Athens, the percentage of overcrowded households is 14%. However, the social and geographical inequalities related to overcrowding conditions are crucial. So, for example, among executives, the percentage is low, around 6%, while amongst the working class, it's about 25%, and specifically among unskilled workers is 37%. This percentage of overcrowded households is even higher in the case of immigrants, as 45% among them live in overcrowded home environments. At the same time, overcrowding is uneven not only socially, but also geographically. So home overcrowding rates are much higher in areas where low-income populations reside, in the northern and western neighborhoods of the municipality of Athens, or in the western suburbs of the broader metropolitan area, compared to those in the wealthy area of Athens and the northern, eastern, and southern suburbs of Attica. Additionally, on top of social, ethnic, and spatial inequalities in terms of living conditions during the pandemic, one should add gender inequalities, which also became more visible. In the invisible work usually undertaken by women in the household level, roles of increased intensive care in conditions of confinement and often in parallel with the obligation of remote work, such as care of young children who are remotely educated or vulnerable people of the extended household, were also added. At the same time, many women were trapped in already oppressive or violent home environments. Moreover, inequalities and exclusions were not limited exclusively to the private space of our houses, but also extended to the public space. One would expect that in conditions of confinement at home, the public space would offer a temporary way out, especially for those who are facing difficult housing conditions. However, especially in the case of the most vulnerable households, in the most deprived neighborhoods of the city, the provision of public space and its quality do not respond to the needs of the residents, while existing public spaces in Athens, such as parks and playgrounds, remain closed. Moreover, specific groups of people, mostly those who experience overcrowding at home, were forced to occupy the crowded semi-public spaces, mostly means of commuting and workspaces, further exposing themselves to the virus. So intensification of this condition of vulnerability. Certain occupations, those working in healthcare, manufacturing, transport, retail, etc., were not offered the alternative of remote work and therefore required to further expose themselves, while the necessary measures for the protection of staff were not adequate in many workplaces. Finally, as far as public space is concerned, invisible populations, so homeless people, sex workers, addicts, for whom public space is the primary or exclusive space of living and of work, were left outside the dominant public discourse and also state support, mostly due to the unofficial character of their work. So, a main conclusion from what happened in Athens is that while the condition of the pandemic was presented by the dominant discourse as a dramatic inversion of our living conditions, both in and outside our homes, for some people, working class people, refugees, immigrants, and women among others, it was in fact experienced as a violent and sudden aggravation and deepening of their already harsh, pre-established living conditions. So I think this part is crucial not to understand how pandemic affected urban life and housing. And I'm going to move into short-term rentals. So the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic and the subsequent implementation of restrictive measures caused a global pause of tourism and therefore the operation of all types of tourist accommodation. For example, in the beginning of March, Airbnb bookings in Europe reduced by 80%. However, globally, there are indications of recovery. According to data by RDNA, at the beginning of June, the new Airbnb bookings worldwide had already increased by an average of 127%, thus approaching the point where they were in February. So while in the first days of April, there were around 900,000 new bookings, by mid-May, the new bookings had increased to more than 2 million. While New Zealand, Germany, France, the United States, and Australia had the biggest recovery. Especially between European destinations, and large urban centers, the largest increase in Airbnb bookings is recorded in Nice, Marseille, Berlin, Lyon, and Naples. Again, it was observed that most of the increase in bookings came from domestic tourism, and in fact, with visitors coming from nearby locations and not from international travelers. In mid-July, for the first time since the pandemic broke out, more than 1 million overnight stays at Airbnb accommodation were booked worldwide. About half of them concerned locations less than 300 miles from the visitor's residence, and the average overnight price was less than $100. Meanwhile, bookings in urban areas remained low, while Airbnb hosts in rural areas, which until recently were not high or popular among Airbnb visitors, saw their profits increased by 25% compared to the same period last year. This is very important for me, and we have to keep it in mind for future considerations. So in Greece, very soon after the removal of travel restrictions, the week from 18 to 24th of May, new bookings almost tripled concerning to the pandemic period. Of the 6,600 new bookings made in the first week of April, so the lowest number of new bookings during the pandemic period, just before the end of May, the new bookings reached 20,000, with traditionally touristic destinations such as Corfu, Rhodes, Mykonos, Thessaloniki, Crete, Santorini, and Athens holding the most important share. Then new destinations, which had never appeared in the list of the most popular destinations, saw an impressive increase in Airbnb bookings. So, for example, during the period from May 17 to June 10, and compared to the same period last year, Larissa, it's a city in central Athens that actually nobody wants to visit. I don't know if anybody from Larissa, increased by 76%. And the same happened to other absolutely non-popular destinations in Greece. While in the whole country, there was a decrease of bookings by 45%. Again, most of the increase in these bookings came from domestic tourism rather than international travel. Regarding the overnight prices, and this is very important in relation with what Agustín and Simone said before, the overnight prices of Airbnb properties for which new bookings were made, it was observed that Airbnb hosts kept the price quite stable despite the fact that the occupancy remained very low. By the end of the summer, bookings for Airbnb accommodations were reported to have risen without reaching the pre-pandemic numbers, of course. So the islands accounted for most of this increase, and overall the increase in bookings was around 4% per week. So based on the number of bookings made up to the beginning of August, the average occupancy of Airbnb accommodation across the country was below 30%, as Agustín saw before. So as for the average price per night, it reached around 100 euros. During the same period last year, the average occupancy was more than double. It exceeded 65% nationwide, while the average price per night at around 80 euros. So Airbnb hosts increased the prices of their dwellings. So, concerning trends of dwellings, withdrawal from the short-term rentals markets, what was referred to before. Compared to the corresponding period of 2019, it is estimated that more than 3,000 properties were withdrawn from the Airbnb market in Athens. So there is a relevant information circulating through the daily press that is contradictory at this point. So on the one hand, some argue that some properties return to the conventional rental market in affordable prices. I don't think this is the case. I will agree with Agustín, because there are many cases of landlords holding on to high rent prices in order to make up for the lost time. Contradictory information is also circulating regarding the period for which the former Airbnb apartments will be available in the long-term rental market. So to my understanding, from what I see in Athens, the owners prefer relatively short-term contracts, around 1 year, which will allow the property to be returned back to the short-term rentals market in the future, in case this market fully recovers and becomes again profitable. At this point, it is worth noting that the trend of withdrawing real estate from the short-term rentals market was not recorded for the first time in the pandemic in Athens. So just before the number of registered Airbnb properties on short-term rentals has decreased since 2019 for the first time. So in Athens, since 2013, Airbnb listings were doubled or more than doubled every year. So in 2009, we had a very small increase for the first time. Our hypothesis related to what with what Chiara said about the professionalization is that the small players are unable to continue to survive in the increasingly competitive market, and they were forced out. So this is what the small increase compared to previous years was about. With their dynamic entry into this market, large real estate companies and large private investors have created economies of scale, managing to significantly reduce costs and consequently offer overnight prices that are lower than those offered by the small players. Additionally, the increasing professionalization of Airbnb business has significantly increased the demands on the management of Airbnb real estates, requirements, especially within the impact of the pandemic, that we have more requirements that small Airbnb hosts cannot meet. Finally, in combination with the above, the increased rental prices in the long-term rental market, which led to the growth. Again, this increase again attracted small owners, small landlords to get their apartments back to the long-term market. Some hypotheses for the future. I think that we can reasonably suppose that the short rental market will continue to grow, independently if it's going to happen or be mediated through Airbnb or other platforms, possibly to a different degree and definitely with different characteristics. So this is going to happen not just because bookings have recovered significantly, even now that's quite early, but mainly because over the last years, the short-term rental market has responded to a specific cultural shift in tourism. So to a new demand from visitors, which is hardly satisfied by the traditional hotel complexes. So this demand concerns the aesthetic, the personalized experience, the desire for visitors to get in touch, but also to interact with the local, to live like the locals, as Airbnb says, something that mass tourism cannot easily offer. Combined with the fact that through Airbnb, all these are also offered in affordable prices, the market of short-term rentals is already holding its ground, and I think that it's going to be durable and competitive in the future. To the above, we must add that short-term rentals successful up to now response to the new demands formed by visitors due to the pandemic. So the latter relate with the increased demand that's already been recorded for safe and secluded accommodation, and is expected to be linked to a whole new way in which people will travel in the future. So first of all, there is already an increased preference of visitors for isolated destinations, close to their place of residence, accessible by private car, in private accommodation and not in common areas of traditional tourist units. Then one can reasonably assume that this trend has already generalized or will continue to do so in the near future. People will travel more within their own country, avoiding public transportation and definitely international travel, if not for holidays, at least for business, especially if we take into account shifts in labor due to the pandemic that will allow most people to work remotely. So digital nomads, people who can work from other places, this is going to play a crucial role. I agree with August and Simone in the short and mid-term rental markets. This hypothesis is already confirmed by the fact that intra-border travel has recovered to about previous levels prior to the pandemic, while international travel has not. This does not mean that people will not sooner or later start traveling again outside their country. However, significant changes are expected in terms of the destinations that they will choose. Until the outbreak of the pandemic, in the context of mass tourism, a large portion of visitors mostly gathered in specific popular tourist destinations. I think that in the future, tourist destinations may increase significantly in number in the effort of visitors to avoid overcrowding. If this happens, it is expected to be accompanied by a series of additional changes in the tourism sector, changes that will not be related only to new and more tourist destinations, but also to the length of stay of visitors in a place, to the activities that they will choose to do there, and the degree of interaction with local communities. This is perhaps a new big challenge in the tourism sector, to which short-term rentals up to now seem to have an increased chance of responding successfully. The biggest challenge for the future, however, it's not just how short-term rentals will evolve, but more generally, how the tourism sector will continue to grow in direct relation to the housing sector, as well as the way in which the unequal living conditions in the cities will be shaped, both for the visitors and for the permanent residents. So the pandemic highlighted the clearest way that the need for us to be fully concerned with the reorganization of daily life and living conditions in our cities, starting with the support of public health towards the ultimate goal of an upgraded quality of life for all. On the occasion of the pandemic, it becomes perhaps clearer that it's impossible to discuss the short-term rentals phenomenon and other sub-issues of urban living without taking into account the wider landscape of housing, of work, of labor, of transport, of infrastructure, private and public spaces, in other words, the complex landscapes of our cities. The need for universal access to decent housing, to affordable housing, for the improvement of public transport, for the strengthening of health infrastructure and basic services, for the upgrading of public spaces, seems to be recognized now from large parts of our societies. Finally, we have to consider how we'll improve the quality of life. This is another issue that came from the pandemic period. How we'll improve the quality of life of those who prove to be the backbone of our societies and were up to now neglected, underpaid, and displaced from the centers of our cities. That's for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Dimitris. Thank you very much. And what you're saying, you are right. We have to focus also on the research about the change of destination. One of my research partners told me that it's isocation from isolation and vacation, and that she was investing on promoting it as an isocation in order to have more visitors. So thank you very much. And let's go to the last of our presenters and introduce James Muldoon. He's a lecturer in political science at the University of Exeter and head of digital research at Autonomy, a progressive UK think tank. His presentation is titled Community Washing Big Tech and introduces the idea of community washing to describe Airbnb's marketing strategy of clocking with their business activities as a form of community building by blurring the boundaries between corporation and civil society to pursue its corporate goals. So the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction. And I just want to start by thanking all the other presenters for such interesting and engaging papers. I've really learned a lot thinking about this, and it's also really good to have some of my own suspicions confirmed from some of the more really interesting empirical data that you've scraped and the research that you've done. So I am very happy to be here, and I want to basically start out by saying I kind of consider my paper to be something of a prehistory to Jelke's paper on the Airbnb strategy of partnering with cities. So if you think like, you know, the Marvel movies franchises, my paper is kind of like the origin story of some of the strategies that Jelke is talking about. So this is like, yeah, going back to kind of 2012, 2014, seeing how it all began. And I think there will be another connection because I know the Jelke's colleague, Niels van Duin, and I've actually learned a lot from Niels's papers during the time. So I'm sure there's some mutual influence there and a lot of points that we might want to discuss later. So I wanted to start with a quote from Brian Chesky, CEO. And I think it's important to note that Chesky isn't just the CEO, but he sees himself and his official title is CEO and head of community at Airbnb. So he says, what makes Airbnb different? At other technology companies, the product is something you can hold in your hand. It's a piece of software. Our product is our community. It's you, it's people. So Airbnb, the product is the community. So this paper is about putting to work some kind of discourse analysis to examine the self-presentation of Airbnb as a global community. And I want to show how this notion of being a global community, or the way in which it presents itself in marketing literature, seeks to combine two major elements. One of those is considering Airbnb as a social movement, which strikes you potentially as quite weird. And secondly, considering Airbnb as a form of community organizing or grassroots community organization. And I really think it's the way in which those two elements are combined that makes this distinctive trajectory of Airbnb in terms of how it's starting to present itself. And I think this kind of first part of the story then weds very nicely to the much more recent strategies of trying to become regulatory partners with cities, trying to partner with and lobby EU institutions and cities. I think that's really, it's an interesting story when you combine the two. So I think we can trace this story back to a period of 2012 to 2017. And basically, Airbnb brought in a new brand consultant to rewrite the company's philosophy, values, and mission statement. If you look at Airbnb and the way some of its documents from 2012, the way it presents itself is about an organization that's connecting people and it's offering unique travel experiences. But by 2017, over the course of this 5-year transformation, we see something completely different. In 2017, its Twitter biography reads, "The world's largest community-driven hospitality company, one which enables you to #belong anywhere." Now, this notion of Airbnb as a global community, I think is really important, because my argument is going to be that it's an attempt to mobilize a discourse of community as a way, firstly, of distracting and covering over its more questionable kind of extractive business practices. But secondly, it's a defensive maneuver to essentially kind of bring people on board and mobilize a constituent audience to further the company's goals. And I'll get more into what I mean by that precisely in a second. So the bigger argument that this kind of small paper is part of is that around 2015 and 2016, you can trace a movement across the American tech sector of digital or platform-based companies that are starting to increasingly use the language of community and global community to talk about their practices. And I think you can see this at Facebook, you can see it at YouTube, you can see it at Instagram. I think there's this kind of trend within the broader sector about how companies can mask their activities and start to mobilize a discourse of community in their PR material. So I think the Airbnb, because it starts much earlier in 2012, I kind of see them as trendsetters. And that's why I think they're particularly important, not simply for the short-term rental market, but for a much broader examination of American tech companies. So before I go into more detail, I think we can look back and see a single figure who is at the center of this story. And that person is a brand consultant named Douglas Atkin. And Atkin was brought in 2012 to help Airbnb define its brand. Now, Atkin is like an advertising agent who wrote a book called The Culting of Brands. So this book studied why people join cults in order to gain insight into how companies could generate true believers in their products. He sought to show how brands could cultivate the same kinds of loyalty and commitment that actual cults and actual big religions used for their adherents. So when he came, so one more thing about Atkin is that he comes from the marketing world, but then he moved into the digital sector. And he was one of the executives at Meetup, the platform where people can kind of schedule open events for anyone to attend. And he also started a consultancy service called Purpose and helped launch a LGBT movement called allout.org. So this is a person who is coming from a brand and marketing background, but has started to branch out into the kind of activism and social movement space. And I think this is where basically these kinds of ideas get transported into Airbnb through this consultant who gets brought in. So Atkins gets brought in. He hires a team to go door to door to Airbnb hosts and guests to start doing market research about why people use the service. What is at the center of it? Now, what he discovers is that people are really into the idea of being at home in someone's house, of not simply having a transactional interaction with them, but feeling like you can discover a city from a local's perspective and have a sense of belonging. So the new motto and marketing slogan that Atkin comes up with for Airbnb is the now well-known #belong anywhere. And that's where they get their new symbol from, which they call the bello, short for belonging. So what's at stake here? What's happening with this rebranding of Airbnb from 2012 to 2014? So the new purpose is to facilitate global belonging. And I see this as a fusion between an idea of Airbnb as a social movement and Airbnb as a grassroots organization. Now, Atkin himself says referring to these two ideas, those are the two formats that enable communities to scale and take action. Mushing them together is what allows Airbnb's management to do what we're doing. And he calls this a distinctive kind of practice that isn't being done by any other tech company at the time. Now, one early manifestation of this was in Airbnb's home sharing clubs. Now, this was an interesting program that basically allowed Airbnb to try and develop civil society organizations that would act as a powerful advocacy bloc for the company. What this meant was that it was about mobilizing hosts to support the company in their efforts to lobby local governments. So Airbnb basically hires professional lobbyists that we all know kind of lobby the EU institutions and will visit officials at city halls. But in addition to this, they're going to have a kind of grassroots mobilization effort to show people that there is this community of supporters behind Airbnb. But it's done so in a very kind of sneaky way. So Airbnb is basically hiring professional community organizers who themselves are kind of paid professionals who embed themselves in local Airbnb communities and encourage the host to take action. So Douglas Atkin calls this program Firestarter, and it actually consciously draws from the community organizing tradition, and in particular, the way in which that tradition was taken up by the Obama campaign in the 2008 and 2012 presidential elections. Basically, the idea is referred to as this snowflake model. So you get one paid staffer who trains a series of community leaders who themselves go on to train other volunteers until your model expands like a snowflake. Now, this is in essence a classic pyramid scheme, right? Because you're training people, you want them to train others and others, so it grows and you can build a larger campaign. So Airbnb actually employed staffers from Obama's campaign to come in and train Airbnb professional staff to start mobilizing in their communities. Now, this doesn't go super well. They get a few key victories, but this campaign kind of peters out a little bit. But it forms an important part in the story. So Airbnb is appropriating ideas from both the social movement world, envisaging Airbnb and its hosts as this like movement in favor of entrepreneurialism, of economic empowerment, and of the short-term rental market. And it also is envisaging itself as this kind of grassroots local community organization that's using these methods from the community organizing tradition. Now, what this does, as I noted in the abstract, is that it's an attempt to blur the lines between community and business, such that in the public's mind, Airbnb is no longer kind of seen as this like corporate behemoth, this multi-billion-dollar company that's trying to get its IPO going again this year, but rather that it's kind of part of the very local communities from which it's profiting. So this turn to community is really, I think, a kind of a cloaking device or a way of trying to pass Airbnb off as something that it essentially isn't, which is a profit-driven firm. So according to a lot of the spin of tech CEOs, and I want to kind of look out a bit broader because I think this kind of language is not used just by Airbnb. I think it's used across the tech sector. But it's this idea that making profit or making these billions of dollars in profit is somehow incidental to or like an unexpected byproduct of what they're really doing, which is pursuing this social mission of connecting the world, giving people a sense of meaning and belonging, et cetera, et cetera. So there is an attempt to distract people here, and there is an attempt to kind of mask what's going on. So I think, and so I call this community washing, and I think it's interesting that Jelke mentioned this term COVID washing, because obviously there's something similar going on there. Community washing, I think, serves a number of important goals for the company. So firstly, when you evoke the idea of community, I think you're evoking what we could call a certain frame. So I'm thinking here of the work of cognitive linguist George Lakoff, who talks about frames being a set or a bundle of associated images and concepts, that when Airbnb talks about itself as a community, they're hoping that you will import all of these positive connotations and then link them to the brand. So firstly, the idea is an attempt to attract new customers to the platform, that this is like Airbnb is one of the good guys, that they have positive social values, that they're going to like look out for you and protect this larger social mission as part of what they're doing. It's also a way of attracting good talent to the company. They want millennials essentially to come and work for them. So, you know, in terms of attitudes towards where they're working, millennials are kind of much more likely. I think 3 out of 4 of them in a recent survey were shown to want to work for a company with a social purpose. So it's also kind of helping out with that mission. And the idea is that by embracing this discourse of corporate social responsibility, that ultimately, in terms of customers, hosts, and its employees, it's going to embrace this new way of doing things that's going to ultimately increase their profit and help their bottom line. So one final thing that I wanted to mention was that Airbnb adopting this method of community washing also enables them to have this defensive move of, well, when they mess things up, when they, you know, are proven to cause a lack of housing affordability, when they're proven to have kind of added to gentrification and these issues that people care about, the notion of them as a community allows them to be perpetually working on their issues. Because what, you know, if it's not a company but a community, you have forgiveness, you have trust, you have a sense of all in it together. You're not opposed interests, but rather you're all trying to work towards the same thing. So this idea that we then see in Jelke's paper of Airbnb talking about partnering with cities, of forming this kind of regulatory entrepreneurship that we've heard about, that this notion of them being part of the community allows them to try and get a seat at the table when they're talking about this regulation, that Airbnb is always accountable, but always failing. You know, so any bad story that comes along, you can just say, look, we're doing our best. We're really trying to solve our problems because we're one of you. We're working towards the same thing. And I think where we see this most of all is in Airbnb's launch in 2018 of their stakeholder report. And, you know, from the UK, this is very interesting to see the notion of stakeholder capitalism or stakeholder society return. Because when it first came about was in the late 90s with Tony Blair and the Third Way movement. And suddenly at the Davos Summit in 2019, everyone's talking about stakeholders. You know, we don't want to just look out for shareholders anymore. We now want to take care of all our stakeholders. But of course, what has Airbnb done over the past 10 years since it launched in, you know, around 2008? It's done very little for its stakeholders. So the idea that in 2018 you could kind of start talking about this, and one of Brian Chesky's quotes is that, you know, this is day one for us, and we're just starting to look into this, I think is very kind of duplicitous and shows the kind of double speak behind this idea of community, that if you really did care about local communities, there would have been a lot more that could have been done a lot earlier. So I think this is very interesting. I think you can see from some of the things that I've been talking about, which I kind of see as like an early story of Airbnb's development, how that then intersects with all these really great empirical analyses that we've seen from the other presenters today. And I think you can kind of see this development. And I think I agree with lots of the predictions that were made. I think that Airbnb will start to struggle a bit with other competitors, that it is going to start to break up and become a much more crowded field, but that you do see this kind of growing idea that these platforms are infrastructure. And I think you see that not just at Airbnb and in the short-term rental market, but many of these social network accounts, Google search, all of this is starting to be integrated in both a physical and a digital level into the processes of our everyday lives. So I'd be very interested to see the discussion that's going to happen, and I'm going to leave it there. So thank you very much for listening.